statistics is a lifestyle, baby. Like, how do you think better in the world?
What
I love
you should be leaving this to when the actual podcast starts to
That's such a good
be
line.
saying these things. That's such a good line.
Yeah, hey, anything you like, I can do it for the TikTok.
Welcome everybody to the Smooth Brain Society. Today Alex is back with us all the way from Germany now, actually, because his move. To be fair, I'm in India right now, so international. And we have Dr. Liza Bolton on from the University of Auckland. Wait, is it Auckland University or University of Auckland?
Ooh, I
For-
think our brand guide would tell you University of Auckland, but that does not stop a single person calling it Auckland Uni.
Okay, yeah, no, because we were technically Victoria University of Wellington, and they tried to rebrand us for God knows how long, and people still call it Vic. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, so Dr. Liza Bolton is a teaching fellow at Auckland University and is and describes herself as a stats enthusiast. We met at a conference where she was talking about statistics and what do you say, journalistic practices and understanding sets. Oh, that was basically the crux of her talk, and she's been keen to come on and kind of talk about some of the misconceptions in statistics, some things to be wary of. I think it's very important considering when we look at any news article ever or anything, even vaguely political, stats are thrown around, but they're not necessarily always interpreted in the right way. So thank you for coming on, Liza.
Thank you so much for having me and for also being flexible about the timing when I was sick last week. So I will hopefully not cough into your microphone too much for today's session. And yeah, thank you for that introduction. I think that's a really, I'll just bring you everywhere with me to introduce me actually, because that's a much better job than I tend to do.
No, no, I quite like the way you introduce yourself on your LinkedIn, on your website, all those things. You make stats sound way more fun than someone like me who does research thinks it is.
Uh-oh.
I think I tend to have a lot more fun with statistics than a lot of people's experiences have been, which makes me, I feel like I'm almost a little bit of a stats evangelical, where I'm like, everyone could be having this much fun, if only, if only. So I'm definitely on a mission to give you a bit of a statistical smile by the end of this.
I love that phrasing.
It's like I'm gonna tell everybody, for audio listeners mainly, that Liza came on with I think a 60 slides presentation as well, with all different examples which she wants to share with us. Of course, we're not going to go through. Of course, we're not going to go through all of them, but that just kind of shows the excitement in wanting to talk about her work, and we're happy to, learn from her. So, I'll actually turn it over to you, and I'll let you decide where you want to get started from. What do you think? Where do you think we should go?
Cool. Yeah, no, I love that. Very dangerous, but I'm very excited to have control of the ship for a little bit. So what I thought I would start with is actually putting up one of my just close to 60 slides. You're right. Because one of the things I really like about your show is this sort of premise of having someone like me who's really keen to talk about my topic, having yourself, of course, as the host, and having Alex, who I've just met for the first time, sort of here as, I guess, our guinea pig. That's my understanding, that we're here to experiment on him.
That's how
So I thought
that's been.
maybe I would get to know Alex live a little bit by asking him which of these bogs he falls into. So a bog is like a swamp or a wetland, or basically something you don't really want to stick your foot in. You want to stay on the boardwalk in between. And this is a concept that's sort of an old concept in stats education, which is sort of part of my background. But I think it's a really helpful concept for all of us to kind of check in on. So I'll explain what these two things are. And for folks who are only listening to the audio, there is like a visual for this, but it does not matter whatsoever. It is just two ChatGPT DALL-E generated pictures of bogs. So on one side, you have the bog of overconfidence. And this is the person who kind of thinks that statistics is basically math, right? and it in some way, or maths, I should say, for our New Zealand and British audience members, but that statistics is this kind of perfect science and that it tells us the truth and only the truth. And it is one way to just be right. You win all your arguments, you're always correct. Ta-da, that is statistics. That is the bog of overconfidence. So if you've ever interacted with numbers and statistics and thought of them as these perfect truths, that might be the bog that you're teetering off the boardwalk towards. On the other side, though, there is the bog of disbelief. And this is probably the bog that me as a statistician, I am most liable to fall into, Alex. So I'm curious which one of these will be your bog. But the bog of disbelief is kind of, oh, well, statistics is just magic. If you are, unscrupulous enough, you can make the numbers say anything you want. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. So yeah, this bog of disbelief is there's nothing of value. There's nothing I can trust here because anyone can just make it say anything. It can mean anything. Does that make sense? Do you sort of feel those two different
Totally.
swamps? Which one is
Totally.
your swamp, Alex? Which swamp would you like to take home today?
Wow, it's such great options between these two bogs. I think I think when I was younger, like back at like middle and high school, totally the bog of overconfidence where I was really into science and I thought, stats and science meant the same thing and or were representative of each other. And it was only when I became more, I don't know, I started taking up more subjects in the humanities. And for context, I did a film and media studies degree, where I would probably put myself in the bog of disbelief because I feel like I've become a lot more interested in bias or the ways in which people present information to get certain results. And I think that's that tweaking that you were mentioning, that sort of magic, it can seem like where you get a set of data and two different people with two different perspectives might come up with completely separate interpretations. So I'm going to take home the bog of disbelief. I think that's me. That's my swamp.
All right, ding, 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 ding. We have a winner. Lovely. Yeah. I really like the way you described that. How about for you, Sahir? Is it one of those bogs called to you in your research experiences?
So it's actually really funny. We were I can give you an anecdote which is pretty cool. One of my uh, uh, I would say colleagues, lab mates, he was doing his master's project and he was doing it on proteomics. So this is like this entire thing of trying to measure proteins in your blood and looking at their composition, and basically the idea that different levels of different proteins are going to kind of indicate towards different mental health disorders. That was basically the idea, but it involved a lot of data and therefore a lot of stats, and then a lot of the readings can also get messed up. So how do you clean all your data and so on and so forth? And I asked him, so what stats analysis are you going to do? And he just said, oh, I'm basically going to sacrifice a goat over the keyboard and see what shows up. and, and
Dark arts and statistics, very, very close.
and you kind of see it the more you start doing working with stats. And I've worked with a lot of stats. I've done like large data stuff. I've done like molecular research and all these things, and the different types of stats you use and the different formulations people come up with. It can at sometimes feel like a bit of a dark art. It can what's going on. There's this thing called there's this type of correction I think called LSD correction, and my supervisor loves it because he's like, it's LSD correction. Who doesn't love LSD?
Yeah. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll. That is the statistics way, as we say.
I love that.
Oh, I love it.
But yes, short of the long, I'm also probably more in the bog of disbelief now. Or more towards that side. I know that you need stats, and they can be very useful, and they are very useful generally speaking. But yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I'm definitely in there with you on my darker days. But when I've done this kind of question with my students who are intentionally in a statistics classroom, a lot more than I expected put themselves in the bog of overconfidence. And this is something we tend to know in stats education, that the folks who come to us on purpose, even though there's a lot of different pathways to being a wannabe statistician or realizing you need some for your degree, whatever else it is, I think, because I'm someone who really cares about teaching ethics and statistics and teaching statisticians how to write and talk to non-statisticians. And yet a lot of the folks who traditionally come to us come with that mindset of statistics as just the math that pays better. You know, you get to maybe be a data scientist and they have good marketing and there's a good job at the end of it. And so actually trying to help them see how much of human decision making and human choice and our attitudes and biases that are present in this work we do, that's something that I really, really care about. And because you were talking, Alex, a little bit about especially being exposed more to the humanities, there's this really cool art installation about statistics. And this is one of the reasons why I really like statistics, because statistics art installation is probably not something we all have a lot of experience with. But being in this field is actually like quite a creatively fulfilling kind of place to be. And so I think there's a lot more to the experience of being in a statistical field that is usually what we like represent in the outside world. And so I don't actually know how to say this name, but it's an art installation called the Library of Missing Data Sets. It's from 2016. It had a physical installation, but you can go see some cool pictures of it online. And one of the really important skills, I think, of a statistician, but also of all of us, I would argue, is this idea of seeing what's not there as well. So you can only sacrifice the goat over the keyboard for the data you have, but how did you choose to get that data? So sir, in this research, you set out an experiment, you just decided certain measures to collect, but what about the things you didn't think to measure? Or what about the group of people who aren't represented in your study because you only have access to, college students from a certain area, that kind of thing. So a lot of, sure, my day-to-day work is dealing with what's in front of me in terms of my data, but having an eye for what's not there, seeing the unseen, and advocating to measure the unmeasured, I think can be a really important role. It's the sort of the yin yang, I guess, of statistics. You work with the data in front of you, sure, you do your best, but it's just as important you advocate for what's not there and realize what isn't there might mean you're missing. That makes sense. So a little bit of statistical art for you.
I was not expecting that. That's really cool. That's really interesting. A way of representing, to people, there is a bigger picture when you're looking at statistics. It's really interesting. I've just been thinking about the bogs metaphor. It feels like people, let's say actors who use statistics in a political context, for example, they have from your description, it seems like there's a trust that people view statistics with that overconfidence, that when someone is handed a statistic, it will meaningfully change the things they believe because it's a statistic and statistics hold power. But I think it's quite interesting to realize that statistics are an interpretation of a data set that was constructed with purpose. Right. Yeah, that's really cool.
That was so beautifully said, Alex.
Oh, thank you.
So beautifully said.
Yeah.
That's kind of an interesting example from just like New Zealand news today. I saw an article, or maybe it was like last night, popped up on the spin-off, and it was about some very specific statistical claims being made about gang membership in New Zealand. And now, this is not my research area or anything like that, but as someone who likes to think about numbers and how we measure things, I was really curious to see what else they'd say about it. And it turns out that it basically was claiming these really high proportional increases of like 6 new gang members a day in New Zealand, and it's increased 41%. I don't have the number in front of me, but I'll give you the link to make sure you can pop it in the doobly-doo if you want. But people are kind of going like, oh, that sounds bad, but is that true? And if you have a look through the article, the source of the data is New Zealand Police. There's sort of a list of, my understanding is, gang members that they are like aware of, basically. So a registry of some format. And the police themselves were actually pretty good about trying to communicate the limitations of that data, and that changes in how they do surveillance or how they categorize these different engagements could be having just as much an effect on those numbers at the moment as actual increases in members. So you could have actually had a decrease in gang membership, but if there was better systems from the police to capture information and add it to this registry, you would see an increase, right? So it's sort of like one of those, exactly as you were saying, Alex, this piece of political data that is being used to hammer home that National is tough on crime and Labor wasn't. And yet the data they're using, well, I'm sure there is some signal there. And doesn't mean it's not a matter for concern or discussion. But I think making sure that the people, as you were sort of talking about, Alex, were engaging with that data politically, realize that statistics is the science of uncertainty, not the science of I am absolutely right and you should listen to me and exactly what I say should change your mind. Like that's not what we do here.
Wow. That's interesting. I haven't looked at that article. I should look at that because that sounds really interesting how they explore that that limitation and how that's been perceived by the media or political groups as well, and then the general public. Yeah. Wow.
I have a friend who's a data journalist who's tried to work quite a lot with New Zealand police data. And we had a really interesting, so this article's out, so I'm not saying anything that hasn't been published yet, but they were looking at missingness. So once again, this idea of what's not there. And I believe it was like search warrant data, if I'm remembering. The article's by Sapir Mehran for Stuff. And it was looking at basically interactions from police, and I think in the context of search warrants. And I was looking at ethnicity for this. But when we're having this conversation, we're going, well, how does this data capture someone with more than one ethnicity? Are they only choosing one? Is the police officer looking at someone and picking what they think their ethnicity is? Or is the person being stopped for a survey about these? And it was the kind of stuff that was really quite hard to get a handle on the quality of this data, because it's not collected as the main purpose of a search warrant. It's collected as administrative data alongside trying to do whatever else is being done. And so trying to tease out, like, one of the points of the story was that the number of missing ethnicity codes seemed to really increase. And you could say, well, is that a sign that they're choosing not to record it because they got a lot of flack over how high the proportions of Maori and Pacific people were? Or has it just become harder for police to collect that data? Did someone make the form back at the office worse and it's harder to collect it in? Like, there's so many logistical and deeply human reasons why data quality might not be good that has very little to do with the data itself in some ways. So yeah, the what's not there is a pretty important feature of the New Zealand like political social landscape. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. Should we move from what's not there to what is there? Because that's the only thing we can actually really interpret and use. Well, no, I guess we can fill things up with what's not there. But I see you pulled up something called restaurant reviews, so you know where you want to go with this.
That's like a little interlude that's a little more fun than searching people's homes and police data. So I have made up 2 fake restaurants for the folks listening. Because I'm a girl who loves a reference and a pun, they're called Gentleman's Gelato and Ihaka's Ice Cream, after Ross Ihaka and Robert Gentleman, the folks who were here at the University of Auckland when they created R, which is a statistical programming language. I am not going to make anyone do any programming today, but I did think I might like to honor these folks in a very, very silly way. So Alex, I'm putting you on the spot, my friend.
Okay.
You are picking. We're all getting ice cream after this. You know, you in Germany, me here in New Zealand.
Sounds great.
India. And it's going to be up to you to pick where we're ordering delivery from.
Okay.
So I've got 2 options for you. You've got Gentleman's Gelato. They have a 4.9 star rating with 4 reviews, and you have Ihaka's Ice Cream, slightly lower at 4.7 with 3,141 reviews.
Right.
Ignoring the names and the signs because these are made up. Well, all of it's made up. But don't use the vibes. Use the reviews and the ratings. Tell me a little bit about where you would order ice cream for us from.
I feel like there's an idea, I guess the idea of safety in numbers would come up to me, right? Like looking at Gentleman's Gelato with the 4 ratings, but a higher overall rating. I feel like I would say well, I guess four people potentially had an amazing experience here, or three people, and then one didn't have such a great experience. But that's great. And then, but more people have had a really awesome experience, or an average awesome experience at Ihaka's ice cream. So I'd probably go with the one with more people, even though it's a slightly lower rating. But that's
I love that. Really well talked through.
Mhm.
So here, how about you?
Oh, see, you shouldn't ask me these questions because I'll say something completely different. I would be going to Gentleman's Gelato more because I want to find out where they lost that point 0.1 star, like what happened. um, or maybe it's because they're new and like we'll try a new place out. Maybe that's why they don't have many reviews. But on the face of it, if suppose instead of like going to an ice cream shop, if this was like a recipe for something
Mhm.
online, and if you're looking for
Oh, I like
recipes
that.
and two recipes are there, one has like thousands of reviews, the other has three or four. Or even if it has like a slightly lower star rating, I'd probably go with that one because I feel more people would have tried the recipe out and vouched for it. Uh, than these. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I love how you both describe that. This is what I taught my dad to do whenever he looks at Google reviews for places. He always tells me when he's done it. I'm very proud of him. Because yeah, exactly as you had mentioned, there's certainly a whole bunch of other like human considerations here. Like, oh, 4 reviews, they must be new. I should give them a try. So I'm not saying only make your decisions with statistics, but I am saying you can use statistics to support good decisions. There used to be sort of a saying in the field of like using data to drive decision making. And I think it should be more like using data to support or inform decision making. Because it's no good taking the human out of it, but it can be really good putting the data into our decision making as a support. So, my statistician approved order for our ice cream, gentlemen, will be indeed Ihaka's ice cream here. But exactly what you were verbalizing to me about, I'd be willing to take the slightly lower rating for having more information here, more reviews. And this actually comes back to a pretty important idea in all statistics. So anytime you have run like a statistical test in your research, there's these ideas both of the magnitude of the effect, the size of this effect, but also how our sample size or how the quantity of data we have available to us, how that helps us think about uncertainty. So the way you could think about it is, okay, sure, you rock up to Gentleman's Gelato, you might have that exceptional 4.9 experience, but you could just as easily, if that's the average experience, but there's not a lot going on in there, sort of pull up and get the 2 star version of the restaurant's experience here. That smaller sample size is going to make it harder for you to sort of narrow in on your uncertainty. Basically, you see a small amount of data, you realize you have a lot of uncertainty about what this experience is going to be like. Even though it looks good, the signal looks good, that 4.9, lovely. I, as the statistician in me, would be like, no, let someone else try that who's feeling adventurous. I want a good ice cream experience. Whereas with Ihaga's ice cream, even though it's a lower value, because I have so much more data, so much more information from other people, assuming there's not a bunch of bots behind our website, which is a whole different story. In this case, I'm going, well, hey, I might have a 4.8 or a 4.6 experience, but in general, it's probably going to be something pretty much in that range. Like, I'm expecting a pretty solid experience. A 4.7 is not bad at all. I wouldn't sacrifice that difference between these two for the sacrifice of certainty that comes from that size of my sample size.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It kind of matters in things like polling as well. Like sometimes it can feel like it's really a small number of people to have like 1,000 people to try to predict an election, but that's actually a pretty good sample size for those kinds of questions. Whereas if I asked 5 people, I would not be putting any money on predicting an outcome for a society level on something like that.
So in that case, suppose we're looking at news articles or whatever about a claim. What kind of sample size would you advise people to be looking for on, yeah, for if
That's a
any
great
claim is
question.
made?
And this is one that students ask me, and I always disappoint them on. So I'm going to disappoint you guys too. Is that while there's definitely rules of thumb out there, there's no true perfect line here. Everything is, there's not some place where it moves from darkness into light. it's a lot to do with the context. So you might see people sort of throw out the number 30 or the number 100, but a lot of it also really matters on how you're cutting up your data into groups. So if I'm trying to make a comment about all New Zealanders and make a pretty good prediction for an election outcome or some opinion poll type thing, 1,000 is actually pretty good if I'm trying to make a claim for, let's say, adult New Zealanders, and I ask adult New Zealanders. But then if I try to take that same data and make a claim about women in their 30s who live in Auckland, suddenly that's a lot smaller of a group within that original data. So even though I might be, reasonably trusting of the quality of an estimate from that larger data set, once I'm starting to cut it up into smaller and smaller pieces, that's losing some of that ability to be precise about it for me. So it's not that the data quality has in any way got worse. It just means that now, in the same way with the only 4 review gelato place, I don't have a lot of confidence. Basically the range of numbers that I'd be willing to accept would be true is going to get really, really wide because I just have a lot of uncertainty about this number if I don't have a lot of data to sort of drive my prediction. And so how you cut the data up really matters. I'd still want at least that sort of 30-ish if I'm doing some sort of simple group kind of discussion. But then if I'm trying to make more complicated subgroups within my groups, that's definitely not going to be enough. So short answer is you probably will see somewhere in a textbook, or if you ask ChatGPT, he'll be like, you need at least 30 observations. But it depends on your method, and it depends what you care about saying and how.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never done a stats course, especially not at university level. But I remember when I was doing like science and I did like high school psychology or something, learning about sample size. I think the thing that surprised me the most was you mentioned it earlier that a lot of studies only have access to college-age students as their sample group. And so a lot of these generalizations that are made about society at large have a very limited sample, or at least range of people or observations, as you said, because it's this one specific group, usually in North America, I think. And so that obviously has impacts for the rest of the world as well. But just again, bog of disbelief, I think is where I'm at.
Yeah, I love that they were exposing that to you because that also ties back into the who's not here, who's not being measured.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm forgetting what the acronym or the initialism is, but they sometimes talk about
Weird.
WASP and weird. White, is it European or educated?
White educated, yeah. What's R? I'm forgetting what R is.
Yeah, I'll have to come back to it.
But yeah, it was Western educated, industrialized. I don't know what R is. And then D is developed. But yeah.
Yes, yeah. So basically, what Alex did a better job of describing, because we both forgot the initialism, is that, yeah, you have in your studies the 30 to 40 people who saw the poster on campus, thought that they could do with an extra $20 gift card for half an hour of their time, and went and did the study or went and did the survey. And that really limits our understanding of the world around us and our understanding of the variety and uncertainty. It's not all about getting a good guess of a specific single number. Part of the goal is also to understand the variability, the variation between people is often a really interesting and important question when we're planning for a world that humans live in together.
I Googled the acronym and it's Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So there we go.
Yeah.
There you go. R was for rich. I feel bad now.
Rich.
That's the one I forgot.
I'm disappointed we all forgot to be rich today, but
yeah, damn it. It's that meme which I keep seeing these days. Well, I was in my mom's womb in 1995 as opposed to buying a house for 25 pence or something.
Yeah, and that's on you, man. That's on you. Really unproductive financial fetus were you.
All right. So what next, Queen of Stats?
I've got a story for you. This one's kind of old, but I think it's a really good one, and that you'll see echoes of the kind of issues that we as humans have with information. You'll see echoes of this in probably what you saw from people on social media in COVID, what you might have seen from people around elections. But it's one specific sort of example of how we're not always the most reasonable with information. I do just want to flag as a brief content warning that I'm going to quickly mention abortion in the context of this case study, but it's not the main topic. But if that is an issue for any of the listeners, maybe you can timestamp when we're finished or something like that. I'm putting that on future you. But yeah, it's not a big part of the study. All right, so this one is old, I guess 1995, back when you were not buying a house, silly, silly you. This story takes place in the United Kingdom. And so there's a United Kingdom, or at least at the time, committee on the safety of medicines. And so if you have people in your lives who take oral contraceptive pills, you may be aware already that these, like for a long time now, have an associated risk of blood clots. So current ones as well, this has kind of been a true feature of these. But by improving the like the formulation of them or like tweaking different things, that's something that's being worked on. But it is just one of those things that's a risk with this particular medication, as any medication can have side effects. But there was this sort of, they called it like a doctor's note, I guess, that came out, and it was sort of meant for like the public to be aware of. And they announced that this third generation, this sort of third version of the pill that was what was most widely being prescribed and taken by people in the UK, it actually had double the risk of blood clots compared to what that previous version had. And they were only sort of seeing that now as they had more data on adverse events from this. But like that's 100% increase. And so this came out and this was publicized quite a lot in the newspapers at the time. So I've got a couple snippets on screen. Oh, I'm sorry that I've got my alt text has kind of shown up for people who can see it. But basically, I've got a clipping from the Guardian newspaper, and the title was "Blood Clot Alert on the Pill," and that women were being warned about 7 brands of contraceptive that were under that third generation, and this doubled risk of blood clots. And as you might imagine, this caused some concern that people who had been taking this, might take this every day of their life, we're now hearing this very scary feature of this medication that they were on, and that was probably quite important to them. And so there were like health clinic lines that were full of callers. Like there was quite a lot of panic is basically what I'm trying to get to you at this point in the story. And so as I said at the beginning, we already sort of knew that oral contraceptives could cause blood clots, and that was a risk. And if you had a precondition that made you more likely to have them, it wasn't an option for you. And the other thing here was that part of that same message that I told you about at the beginning, where it says double the risk, 100% increase, it also in the same message said, for the vast majority of women, the pill is a safe and highly effective form of contraception. No one needs stop taking the pill before obtaining medical advice. So Alex, what do you think people did? Do you think they calmly waited for medical advice? Or do you think they did something else?
I'm going to wager that they did something else.
Yep. I think if you're a betting man, you're safe for this one. The use of this pill dropped like 80%. Wow. People just stopped taking it. They were freaked out. They didn't want to deal with the risk. They just stopped taking it. There was like a run on the pharmacies. People were trying to get the second generation one, which was the previous one that this new one has double the risk of. So let's go back to the safer one. None of the chemists had anything left in them. Like it was a little bit of a public panic kind of moment. And now one really important thing to consider here is it wasn't just that people stopped taking the pill and that then meant there was fewer blood clots. Like, sure, if it was just that, fine. But there's kind of a reason that people take this medication in the first place. And there's lots of different reasons why different people might be taking it, but for quite a lot of people, it is for the purposes of contraception. So for people listening to the audio alone, I've got a graph on the screen, and the title is that there was 13,500 more abortions in the period after, or it's sort of the appropriate period after October 1995, and that sort of flow-on effect. And so the graph on my screen shows that in general, the rate of abortions had been, in fact, not even just the rate, the absolute number of abortions in the UK had been decreasing, even as the population was probably increasing at the same time. So you were on trend where people had access to contraception that worked for them, arguably, and you were seeing fewer and fewer abortions. you saw them in this period after 1995 jump right back up to what they had been, 5 years previously, before we were doing a good job of decreasing. And then, sorry, excuse me. And then proceed to stay high for a few years afterwards as the information about the fear remained. But that message that was in that first part of like at the same time that it was announced, where it's like, no one needs to stop taking this. It's fine. Talk to your doctor at your next checkup. Um, that part didn't really manage to be part of this persistent messaging. And I think one fact that was particularly like shocking to me, I guess, from this, or that really gave me sort of emotional connection to this story, was that there was 800 additional conceptions among girls under 16. So folks who might have been relying on this in some way, not have a lot of access to other things, and arguably may not have been intending pregnancy at that time. And I found that quite a surprising number, that this statistic and its influence on our emotions was a really powerful social disruptor for a little while there. This also just has dollar signs attached. So if you're like, I don't care, I don't need to take the pill, 4 to 6 million pounds more were spent by the National Health Service in that time, which is a good chunk of change. So this, to me, is clearly something went wrong here. This wasn't the appropriate response from the public, although it probably could have been anticipated. I'm curious, if I sort of stop at this point, what questions do you have? Like, what would you have wanted to know if you were receiving this in the media, or if you had, a person in your life who was trying to make a decision? Do you feel like you had all the information you needed to make a choice here?
I think I'm interested in double the risk, right? Because double the risk sounds really alarming, and I think you can kind of understand the response from that perspective, because that's a scary phrase. But I'm interested in the initial risk from the second generation before it gets doubled. Because if it's like the risk is like 0.01 and it doubles to 0.02, is that correct for doubling? That is that significant? I don't know.
I love that, because yes, if only Alex, folks had you to ask at that time, because that is exactly the question you want folks asking themselves. And there's a whole other area of study that's outside of mine about like our risk tolerance and like when we think of different risks and things like that. But fundamentally, if you double a really small number, you still have a really small number. Mm-hmm. And so I'll show you just sort of briefly what this kind of looks like, I guess, as a picture. But basically, you've got two types of risk that you might have reported to you in the media. And this is a pretty common statistic. Maybe odds are more common if you're really into horse betting, but risk, like absolute risk, is just a straight probability. So your risk of getting hit by lightning is pretty low, unless you're a New Zealand MP, it appears, in which we've had like 3 of them hit by lightning. I do wonder. But absolute risk is just the chance of something happening. And so for the oral contraceptive pill, you could calculate that for yourself. And what the researchers had done was they looked at the total number of people who were taking that pill, and then they found out how many people had a blood clot. And that's just one number divided by another number. So I have on screen some terrible animations that I still love because I'm the one who drew them. And so let's say we have our 10 people who are taking an oral contraceptive pill. If 3 of them get blood clots, that's 3 out of 10 people. That's 30%. That's awful. That's a pretty high level of blood clots that I probably wouldn't, I too would be jumping ship pretty quickly on a medication like that. But that's not what we really meant here. Because what does it mean to double the risk? This is something we call a relative risk, because it's one number being compared to another. It's not that baseline or that initial risk that you were talking about, Alex. And you might hear this as like twice the risk or a 2-fold increase or any of this kind of language of doubling and increments. This is this relative risk idea. And so exactly as you were trying to think through for yourself, you're like, okay, 0.01, if I double that, that's only 0.02. You can see that if you had an absolute risk of 30% and that doubled, that would be 60%. Awful. Jump ship, absolutely. If you had a 3% risk, that's a 6% risk. I don't feel as invested in that difference in this case, personally at least, right? And that goes back to not just statistics, but your personal risk tolerance. But now if you're going from 0.3 to 0.6, I'm struggling to muster much of an emotional response at all to that difference. Like that doesn't feel like something that's going to overly motivate me to change. Sorry, to change what I'm doing. I don't actually have the number directly in front of me, but the risk from the second generation oral contraceptives was much smaller than even what I have on screen. It was something like 0.1 in 1,000 or even smaller than that, I think. I'm sorry I don't have it to hand. I can send it to you later if you want to put it somewhere. And so in the end, the doubling of that risk, while it may have some influences on a population level across millions and millions of people, personally, the risk of not taking a medication like this would far outweigh, or the risks associated with not taking the medication would far outweigh. And I think on a social level, the potentially negative consequences also far outweighed what the blood clots could have caused on both a societal level and on an individual level. And so, exactly as you said, Alex, like freaking scary to have this headline about blood clots. Awful, awful. No, thank you. But then if we don't know how to ask ourselves these questions, we can very easily trap ourselves in situations where we're just making decisions based on fear of things we don't need to be afraid of. There's enough things I'm afraid of on a day-to-day basis anyway. I don't need to like have fake new ones, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
So I have a question for you, Alex. Do you eat bacon personally, or do you have a favorite food?
I have bacon occasionally.
All right.
I don't know that I could come up with one single favorite food.
Let's take it because I have had a look at these numbers once upon a time. But like a more recent example is I don't know if you ever saw, and by recent I think it's probably the last 5 years, is that bacon was listed as a carcinogen, a cancer-causing substance, along with, and you perhaps may be sorry to hear this in Germany, land of the lovely sausages, that any of those kind of cured meats or processed meats in some way increased people's risk specifically of bowel cancer. And I believe, and I'm sorry, I don't have this number in front of me, but it was something like a 14% increase in risk. And when I started looking at that, I was like, the people I know who really like bacon, that seems like not that bad an increase or anything like that. And then when I was taking a look at the numbers, especially in New Zealand, and especially I believe it was among older men, and there's also variation by ethnicity, the baseline prevalence, or sort of if you were eating fairly healthy, just your general risk of getting bowel cancer is actually kind of high for some of our populations. And so while a 14% increase is nothing as scary sounding as a 100% increase, when I was looking at those numbers, and if we're going to report bias, I am a vegetarian, so perhaps I don't have as much skin in this game. But looking at that increase, to me, I was like, oh, that was actually enough to like tell my dad that I don't think he should eat as much bacon, because even though it was a smaller relative increase, because it was still of a kind of high level of just prevalence of people just get quite a lot of bowel cancer in New Zealand. It's a real medical problem for us. That actually had me kind of worried. So I think it's a total overreaction to stop your pill for 100% increase. But I don't think it's that bad an overreaction to limit your bacon intake for a 14% increase. So that relative and that absolute, it really matters that you have the full picture there.
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
I was gonna ask about another example just to elaborate on that point. This is a news example, so maybe you might not have the exact things, or I don't have the exact numbers either. But I remember during COVID, there was a lot of justification by certain governments being like, "Oh, it's only a 3% of the population is affected by this or is dying," or something like that, right? Like they were saying, like it's only 2% or 3% of the population will probably die by this or whatever. But then you kind of extrapolate it to the pure numbers, and you're saying, so you're talking about what's it? If you have 100 million people in a country, 3%, you're talking about 3 million people dying here. You're okay with this? All of a sudden, these small percentages actually mean quite large numbers.
I think that's such an important human example. If the question is, okay, I'm sort of discounting small percentages in some cases, but in the COVID example, you're like, oh, it's only 3% of the population. But then when you're starting to think of, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people globally, I think it gets to this really important interface between humans and numbers. Because a small change, like a change between 0.3 and 0.6 that I was talking about earlier as not being particularly meaningful to me, in some contexts, that would actually be super important. And it's one of those things where for some stories, it would be a rounding error. But for other contexts, that could be the difference between a business going bankrupt or, growing and profiting. It could be the difference between a global pandemic and, oh, thank goodness we had that contained and nothing happened. And I think just as your sort of question earlier about sample size is like, what's the threshold? What's the threshold? All of this is so context dependent that you need to know. And one thing I really cherish as a statistician is working with subject matter experts in the applied disciplines that I'm working on. Now, I have been talking to this wonderful woman doing research on tuna and how people interact with and use tuna in Kiribati. And I know nothing about any of those things, but I know a little bit about survey design. And so having conversations with a subject area expert helps you tease out what actually matters to measure and how. And that's the same with interpreting these numbers. And I guess the only guide I'd have for folks there is the same sort of media literacy you'd apply to influencers on social media, to political claims, even if they don't involve numbers. The key question to ask yourself as a person who has to navigate this information saturated world is, what is the person who's telling me this? What do they want me to think? And why might it be important to look farther than that? And numbers are just one of those tools that we have to influence people. And as Alex was saying earlier, for those of us who might fall into the bog of sort of overconfidence, where we think a statistic can be used and wielded basically as a cudgel against the non-believers, we want to be really careful of, like, why are we using that number in that way? Are we trying to present it as the small percentage because we know our reader or our listener would be horrified by the actual numbers? No easy answer. We just got to use our brains, as smooth as they may be.
That was nice. That was very well done.
That's very, very, very eloquent.
Well, I was so thrilled with your response, Alex. Like, what question would you ask? You nailed it in one. That is the question you want to be asking yourself when you're presented with those things.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it feels like, I don't know, I guess I am quite suspicious of data. I think it is because in media studies and stuff, especially when you're studying things like news, this sort of thing comes up when you're looking at how different, events, let's say climate change is portrayed by people, on either side of the issue, people who, strongly believe in climate change and are urging people to, how they use data versus, I don't know, should we say skeptics, would use other data to try and say, well, look at this, it's periods of heating and warming or whatever they're saying, right? Totally. Yeah, numbers are a weapon that everyone seems to use.
Yes. Heck yeah. And you want your weapon sharp and your wits sharper when it comes to numbers, I think. Yeah, I love how you describe that. Yeah.
I think from a more science perspective, I think one of the biggest things which changed in between me being what we were taught in undergrad versus our approach to looking at research in masters and PhD was that we went from reading all these articles and believing that this is the truth, that, oh, they found this association, oh, they found this, to going, we went from that in undergrad to all of a sudden being like, okay, so what was their sample size? Like, how did they run this experiment? Or if we're doing a bio experiment, what chemicals did they use? Because that could affect things. There were so many other things we started looking at and started critiquing, which we didn't before. What actual statistics did they use? Like, what analyses did they use? We were also, are they hiding any data in the graphs which they presented? Oh, you kind of change completely from what you're taught in undergrad. And I think all of us would have been a lot better off if they had taught us those things beforehand, because then all of a sudden we wouldn't be so scared when we read these massive, eye-catching, like, stories and like all these weird graphs which show up without a correct X and Y axis. Yeah, I feel like there's a real missed opportunity for so long in terms of that, in helping people learn how to understand, statistics and how they work.
Yeah, that's so well said. Now, Alex, I did a little bit of sneaky looking up of you before I actually came on this call. Would I be correct in thinking this? I swear this is related, Zahir, to what you just said. Would I be correct in thinking you are interested in the TTRPG, tabletop role playing?
Oh my goodness, you're 100% correct.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I was very happy to see that because it meant I didn't have to plant some knowledge in y'all beforehand. So here, when you have done statistical or read statistics specifically, even in your own, whether it's reading other people's work or doing your own work, have you come across something called a p-value?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Have you learned to kind of hate and fear them in the same way that I have?
I mostly hate them, sometimes fear them. But yeah, I tell all my students that it's not scary, it's easy, and trust me. But at the same time, inside you know that it's a bit more or a bit
You gotta
less
fake
than
it till
that.
you make it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the quote about democracy that democracy is the worst system except for all the others?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is basically how I feel about the p-value. Although, if you have any Bayesians in your audience, which is like kind of the version of statisticians that like wear leather jackets and they smoke if smoking wasn't bad for you and is cool, like think sort of grease lightning greasers. Like they're the cool kids, and I'm not a Bayesian. I'm just a boring old normie frequentist. But anyway, the p-value. It is the worst metric except for all the others. It's the best one we've got. But the reason, Alex, I wanted to ask you about tabletop games, specifically ones using dice, is as someone who's interested in this gaming, could you tell me what the chances of getting a natural 20, rolling a 20 on a 20-sided dice? You don't have to calculate it. You could,
know
whatever comes.
this. I know. I think it is 5%. You get a 1 in 20 chance, obviously, and I think that's 5%, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. 1 in 20 is exactly right. Assuming you brought a fair dice to the table, which I'm sure we all would do here, you're
Yes.
exactly right. It's a 1 in 20 chance. And so that I think tends to like, it's special for anyone who's listening going, what are they talking about? Getting this 20 is like a pretty special experience in gaming because usually it means something good. And it's rare enough that it's special if it happens, but it's not so rare that it's impossible. Like you'd still be like, maybe I'll get one, even if you try something impossible.
Mhm.
And that kind of vibe is basically the vibe that underpins most statistical research. We use this 5% threshold to say, if this was true, so we make some statement like, okay, if in this research there's really no difference between the drug I'm testing and a sugar pill. Sorry about the window again. If there's really no difference, how likely is it that I would see the kind of result I got in my study? And basically, Alex, what we do in statistics, in applied statistics, is a lot of the time, if we say, if it's less likely than getting a nat 20 that I would see this result if nothing was going on, I'm going to claim something is going on. But the thing about this is it is still uncertainty. It is still a roll of a dice. I could see a really big difference between two values just by chance. Or I could fail to see a really important difference because I don't have enough data, or I just got unlucky with the rolls of the dice the universe was giving me. So we use it, and a lot of folks, especially who come through, I think psychology is probably very much persecuted by the p-value.
Oh, yeah.
I think we sort of raise our young researchers to have this 0.05 threshold. And I think at the back of their heads, it must be in some stone scroll or like stone tablet upon a hill. Surely there is some reason why we devote our lives to the worship of the 0.05 threshold. And I've heard two stories about why this is the case. One is that back in the day when statistics books had to have tables in the back of them, so you could like look up different numbers when we didn't just be able to put it in a calculator. The version I first heard was whoever was making it did a couple columns, got tired, and figured that was a good place to stop. Because yeah, it's good. I may be absolutely spreading misinformation, but it's joyful misinformation because I have not found anyone online who corroborates that. The other part of the story I've heard is there was a little bit of a copyright war between two statisticians in the 70s who weren't really getting along. Statistics tea that's like 50 years old for you, so piping hot. And basically the one guy was like, I can't just copy the table the other guy did because he'll sue me because he's like that. So I'll just pick a couple columns and make my own version and it'll be different enough. And then in trying, and I think the underlying effort was to try to make it a little bit easier for non-statisticians or new statisticians. But in this effort to simplify, as is the case in I think all fields of research in life, in the effort to simplify, some of that nuance is lost. And so now we worship at the altar of the Nat 20, effectively, Alex, in a lot of our research, without, I think, as sort of Sahir was saying earlier, we sort of get our students reading these papers or reading this research and kind of thinking about it as like, these researchers have done this perfectly, and these findings are perfect, and this is truth. This is bog of overconfidence. And then the farther in you go, you're like, we're doing it on vibes, man. 1 in 20 seems kind of cool. Let's make our whole discipline do that, right? So I think it's so important to kind of dismantle some of this, like the ivory tower that statistics and academia is in, to try to give people, not so that they doubt us, right? Not so that they think, oh, there's no point listening to scientists or listening to researchers, but so they kind of realize it's a bunch of folks doing their best to give you the best information they have to hand. And even when they do their best, they will be wrong. This is why we collaborate. This is why we iterate. And this is why we don't do something only once.
You missed out. You could have said this is why we replicate, and it would have rhymed really well.
This is why we replicate. Turn. Yeah. Take it from the top, boys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll save that one for my statistics, Dr. Zeus book. That publication imminent for sure.
Sounds good.
Great.
Right. So you've got another slide up. I think because we've got about 10-15 minutes left, maybe we can go through one last example on what you were talking about. And yeah.
Does the music one seem like a good one to end on?
Let's do it.
All right. So Alex, what kind of music do you listen to, if you don't mind me asking you?
I mostly listen to indie rock.
Indie rock?
Yeah, and lots of British rock and stuff like that.
I love. Any bands want to drop for the discerning among us to go frantically check out later to act like they're cool?
Well, I would say my all-time favorite band would be Wolf Alice, who, are definitely in that rock genre. And very indie, I think. Oh gosh, I can't think of anything really bigger right now. I'm listening to a lot of Hozier at the moment.
Oh, fair. Man of good taste, for sure.
Yeah.
How old? So Wolf Alice, for that, is it a band? Is it a single person?
Yeah, it's a band. And I think they've been making music for a decade now, and I think they're in their mid 30s, maybe early to mid 30s, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, perfect. And that was actually going to be the exact next thing I asked you. So thanks for setting that one up for me.
Okay.
So indie rock certainly isn't a completely new genre, right? Because even just your example, they've been around for 10 years. But I don't think my Nana, who's turning, I believe, 88 next month, she wasn't listening to a lot of indie rock back in her sort of teens, 20s or anything like that. Does that seem like a fair? She could have just been missing out, but I think it was generally because there wasn't a lot of indie rock back then.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I've sort of wanted to have that little bit of a conversation first is there is a chart I have on the screen, and this was really sort of doing the numbers on social media, actually probably about 10 years ago, I think, at this point, maybe a little less. But it was a really interesting study that someone had done looking at kind of like the survival of musicians. Now, have you guys heard of the idea of like the 27 Club, like Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse tragically dying really young?
And Jimi Hendrix as well?
Oh, I think you might be right.
Jimi Hendrix as well, 27?
Yeah, so some like iconic, basically, members of this pretty tragic club idea. And so I think that probably you might also have the general sense that certain types of music are associated with like harder living. So there might be like drug culture, or it might be a lot more common to be shot or something like that. Like it could be dangerous to be a popular musician in certain genres and certain places in the world, right? We don't tend to think of jazz as that dangerous in the modern era. I don't know about you, but I haven't heard too many jazz musician rivalries ending with a shootout, at least this year, maybe last year. So the graph that I have in front of me, and the last thing I wanted to share with you, because I think it comes up a lot in things we see in our lives, but isn't necessarily something we even teach in like an intro stats course or teach people or do a good job of teaching people. And I take that blame on myself. So on this chart, you have a range of different genres, from blues at the far left end down to like rap and hip hop on the far right. And the graph, there's a couple things wrong with this graph, and there's a link that I can share if you want to go deeper into it. But basically, the sense of this graph is you can see that US female and male life expectancy has sort of increased over time. But you can see really big differences between musicians who are like blues, jazz, and country, who are kind of doing pretty well for the national averages. And yet you're seeing this really shocking sort of dip for more what you might associate with like harder lifestyles these days, perhaps in punk and metal and rap and hip hop. And so the reason this chart was so popular is, and we've just had this conversation, right? 27 Club, you can see in your head, how many rap songs do I know that are about drugs? A lot more than I know that are about jazz. Then again, Frank Sinatra got up to some stuff with the Rat Pack. But anyway, this, if you take a quick look, sorry, you can see where my musical reference points are coming in. Taking a quick look at this graph, imagining it comes up on your Facebook feed, or at the time it was published, your Twitter feed, it really sort of confirmed things that people kind of already might have had a vibe on. And so it got shared and was really used to kind of, beat up metal, rap, and hip hop for those terrible lifestyle choices. The thing that we sort of talked about, Alex, though, with the genre that you like with indie rock, is it's not that old a genre. So some of the sort of leading lights in it are probably not even that old, right? So the band you were talking about are in their 30s. You could argue till you were blue in the face about the origins of rap and hip hop, and they all have deep historical origins. But as popular music genres that are recognizable, they're not very old. The 70s maybe. So for you to be an artist in that genre, you haven't had a chance to live to a ripe old age yet. You cannot be 100 and have started as a rapper in your 20s at this point. That's just not, unless you're doing some time travel, that's probably not going to math. The math is not mathing. You absolutely can be a 100-year-old former jazz singer because jazz has been around for a long time. And this is, it's a subset of things that are sort of these survival or selection biases. But this is a specific subset. So the vocab I'm going to drop on you is this idea of right censoring. So censoring, you might think of an Alex as like in media, as if I was putting my black redacted tape over text. And it is kind of that idea. I can't see into the future. No matter how good I get at statistics, I do not get that power. And by my inability to see into the future, it is censored to me. It is redacted. It is a black line on the text of the future. And so I can't see how long the people who are still alive are going to live. I can only see the people who have currently died. And because it's a young genre, if you've died young at this time. So 400 years from now, when the ethnomusicologists do this graph again for these exact same sets of genres, and we've far moved past them into super techno solar cyberpunk, we will probably see all of these look pretty similar because they will just be people who are making music and dying like all people do. Is that an upbeat thing to finish your podcast on? And music and rock and roll.
I mean, kind of. It's good to know that Snoop Dogg and Eminem and all will probably live to this average age of most jazz musicians. If maybe
we reassuring with us for a while longer.
I'm so thankful.
I guess with the graph as well, as it shows increasing life expectancy as well, as life expectancy goes up, you might even see 100 years down the line some rock and hip hop and all these artists actually exceeding or going over, right? Because
I love that because the music they play is probably not the driver of their longevity. Exactly as you're saying, the context they live in, better medicine, we know you shouldn't smoke now, like all of that societal knowledge is probably going to be a bigger driver for the majority of musicians for what their long-term health looks like, not just that they are like cool and hip and slightly emo bands or whatever. That's such a good insight because that's exactly right. Those ethnomusicologists 400 years from now might see something that looks completely inverted from this, where you go, wow, what good health all our hip hop stars were in. How delightful.
Wow. I hadn't even I hadn't realized. I was trying to make sense of this graph myself. Like,
it's a tricky one.
What could be the thing? Yeah, no, it's great though that it that the youth of the genre means that you just that line you said, you only have the data of the people who have died, and because the genre is young, they've died young. So it's going to skew it
Mhm.
completely. I just didn't even make that connection. That's wow. I think
Yeah,
that was
and
a great
why
one
would you
to
if
end on.
your first thing is already like, oh yeah, this agrees with my preconceptions. And I
Yeah.
will be fair to the original author that she does mention that, or I believe it was she, or the author mentions this as a confounding feature. But you can't
Hmm.
step from this chart because, as we were talking about before, anytime you attempt to simplify, you lose nuance. And
Mm.
that's actually really a hard kind of thing to get across in a graphic. You'd really have to change the graphic here. And
Mm.
so I think whoever probably put this together was doing the best with what they had. But a really key part of the understanding of the way to think about this data in order to understand it completely gone if you don't have the little questioning voice, the little statistician who sits on your shoulder and asks you these questions.
Would a more, let's say, quote unquote, fair, or I don't know if that's the right word, graph be something that looked at the relative use of these genres and then went back to something like blues and said, looked at the first, let's say, 30 years, and then looked at the I don't know, I don't even know how you do that, but comparing the same
Yeah,
band of time would probably provide a more equal result, right?
that's a fantastic idea. Because exactly, if you were interested, if you changed your research question a little bit and were like, which genre of music saw the worst premature death rates? And you go
Mm.
death before 30 or death before 35, pick something that seems kind of fair based on some of the genres you're picking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fabulous question, Alex. And that would give you probably a really different insight where
Mm.
if it's old blues or jazz, you might be seeing people who are still suffering from tuberculosis, people who are
Yeah.
dying in World War II, when, there's all these other features that exactly as Sahir was saying before, you might actually see that there's lower premature mortality in some of our modern genres because these folks haven't gone to fight in a war. They have access to treatment for tuberculosis. Like a lot of the things that are actually driving mortality here are not your taste in music.
Mm. Wow.
So such a good
Awesome.
question.
I That was really good. I think that's a good place to end on. I think so.
Yeah,
This is
absolutely.
That was great.
Thanks for just like letting me run wild on all my favorite topics. How cool has this been?
Well,
It's been really cool.
we can let you run wild for longer. Maybe we can have you back on next time with more examples.
Don't tempt a
We
girl.
haven't covered so many things. I saw a slide there called p hacking, which is a whole different thing. We just touched upon the p value, but we didn't even get into any of the scarier stuff of how things data can be manipulated.
Oh
So
yeah, there's a fantastic interactive that either you can pop a link into it or yeah, if your listeners will let you have me back, believe me, could I tell you some more stories about what you can do if you want to do wrong?
awesome. Well, before you say goodbye to the listeners, last thing which we will ask you is if you have any one piece of advice for them before you go, and that's how we would end. So,
Yeah, thank you for this question. What I hope folks might have got from this or might be able to get from other sources is you don't have to have been a math genius to be a good statistical thinker. And I want for all of us, if I was ruler of the world or had my magic wand, good statistical thinking would be the wish. If I was the world's fairy godmother, let's make it a little more benign. I wave my little wand and we are all more confident and thoughtful statistical thinkers. On the other side, if you are a math whiz, that doesn't automatically make you a good statistical thinker because a comfort with uncertainty, the ability to see what's not there, and a sort of questioning mindset might be part of your good math set, but if you're just a timetables whiz, that's not the same thing. So I hope your listeners are a little more enthusiastic. They have perhaps the beginnings of a statistical smile after this conversation, and maybe a little bit more confidence that they're asking good questions and that there are good ways to interrogate the data that is being presented to them. Half the world goes to the polls this year in 2024 when we're recording. And I think there's no more important time than present to be more confident in our ability to make good decisions and to have data as one of the things in our toolkit to make those good decisions.
awesome.
Beautiful. Well said.
Very well said.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me say it.
Awesome. So thanks, guys. Thanks, Alex. I hope you enjoyed that.
I love that. It was really great.
Yeah.
Super fun.
All right. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Bolton stalking you online as well for
Yeah, well, that was
I
a
love your
genuine
Substack.
surprise.
Yeah.
Shout out to Alex's Substack.
Yeah, Alex has
Thank
got a
you.
few podcasts going as well. You should follow all of them.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually really interesting. I've spoken to quite a few people about statistics and dice things as part of those projects, which has been really fun.
I literally coded up one to make better decisions in Baldur's Gate 3 because I was trying to figure out whether using bless or having advantage was going to be better for one of my skills checks. So
Yeah.
that way is a slippery slope to further statistics, my friend.
Oh, delightful.
All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks everyone for listening, and yeah, we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.